Hi folks. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 20 from your textbook. In Bio 101 we talked a lot about structure and function and how the structure of something was very correlated with how it functioned. And that's true with animals as well. So today we're going to be talking about the concepts of animal structure and function and how they connect. There we go. So through the course of Bio 101 and this semester too, we've touched a lot on evolution and how organisms adapt over time to change to accommodate the environmental conditions. I'm sorry, my slides are skipping around here for some reason. I'm having some technical problems. So does that mean that over time there will be this perfect animal form, that eventually there will adapt the perfect animal? And the answer to that's no, because environmental and the habitat conditions are constantly changing too. So these physical structures and adaptations it's a constant evolution to enhance an animal's chances of survival and successful reproduction. But this theme of this correlation between structure and function is one of the overarching themes of biology. That's why we talked about it through last semester, and we're again reiterating this importance now. Sometimes animal structures are just good enough and not necessarily the ultimate design, and evolution continues to help organisms meet the expectations of their environment. So, for example, if we look at this guy, this is a giraffe. Why do giraffes have a neck that's 6 feet long? They evolved from animals that didn't have these long necks, but they were living in an environment where there was a lot of competition to forage on the vegetation that was at their level. So over time, the organisms, the animals that had longer necks, were more successful and passed along their genetic information, their genetic information as they reproduced more successfully, because they were more able to reach the higher food that others were not competing for. So in this chapter, we're going to be touching on some few main ideas. We'll talk about the structure and function of animal tissues. We'll kind of revisit what organs and organ systems are, and we'll talk about how those systems help an organism maintain homeostasis. So the structure and function in animal tissues. So for example, the laryngeal nerve of an adult giraffe travels from the brain, makes a U-turn around the aorta in the chest, and then extends back up the neck. So it's about a 15-foot long nerve. Why would this be an adaptation that has come to be in these animals? And this actually helps us to explain, it helps to illustrate this concept of evolution. And how the ancestral organism can become modified through its descendants to make a more adapted version. So here is an image of the laryngeal nerve. So as we mentioned, it travels down the brain, it kind of wraps around the aorta and travels back up to the brain. So why does it have this long trip? And it has to do with how these organisms evolved over time. So pre-evolutionary giraffes had much shorter necks, so it wasn't making this big long trip. But the nerve has always been placed where it is kind of wrapped around the aorta. When the head was located much lower, that really wasn't much of an issue. But over time, we can see that through evolution, this nerve has had to become elongated. So what we can use this example of this lamp that's plugged into an outlet, and that outlet is located pretty close to the wall. So the nerve, with that cord, which kind of illustrates the nerve here, has plenty of slack. It doesn't need to be, it's not stressed out for any way. One option, if you wanted to move the lamp away from the wall, one option would be because it's wrapped around the table in the first illustration, one option would be to unplug it, move the table away from the wall, and then plug it back in. But unfortunately, that's not really something that an animal would be able to do. If you unplug the nerve, then it no longer functions. So what has happened is that over time, as the table or the head of the animal has become further and further removed from the wall, it's stayed plugged in, but it's continued to be wrapped around the table. So that's how we illustrate that evolutionary development in the nerve of the laryngeal nerve of the giraffe. So this is probably a little bit of review for most of you, but just to reiterate the difference between anatomy and physiology. When we're talking about anatomy, this is the study of the physical structure of an organism. So, it's the heart is an anatomical feature. Your fingers are anatomical features. But physiology is the function. So again, anatomy and physiology, the reason those courses are taught together is because structure and function go hand in hand. So physiology is how something functions. So the physiology of the heart is to pump the blood. And animals consist of levels of organization of how we are built, essentially. So we're going to talk about these, the different levels in more detail, but what we're talking about here, these levels of organization, is the fact that tissues make up organs, and organs work together to make up organ systems. And so the tissues are types of similar cells that work together to perform a common function. They make up they make up organs, which are a group of similar tissues working together to perform a specific task. And organ systems are multiple organs that perform a major bodily function. So this is just an illustration of what I just mentioned, that we have cells which make up our tissues. So tissue might be something like muscle tissue. Muscle tissue makes up an organ like the heart. The heart and veins and arteries work together to make up the organ system of the circulatory system. And all of the different systems, all of the different organ systems make up the organism as a whole. So the organism has many functioning systems working together. Okay, so just breaking this down, we'll talk about what each of these levels consists of, and the categories of things that make them up. So tissues, again, we're talking about groups of similar cells with a common function. And there are four main types of tissues. We have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So starting with epithelial tissues, these are the tissues that are closely packed cells that cover the surface of cover the body surfaces and line our internal organs and cavities. They're named depending on the type, the shape of the cells, and how many layers they are. So we'll take a look at these. So the different types of epithelial cells are referred to as, based on their shape. So we have squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. And again, this is just essentially referring to how they're shaped. So squamous, these are like flattened cells in a layer. Cuboidal, they actually are shaped sort of like cubes. And columnar cells are kind of long and thin like a column. So simple squamous, because there are 3 different shapes but 4 different types of epithelial cells, and the difference being that there are simple squamous and stratified squamous. And all that means is that simple squamous cells are, there's just one layer of those squamous cells, whereas stratified squamous, like our skin, which has many, many layers, is referred to as stratified squamous. So they're the same shape, they're kind of flattened layers, but stratified means that there are multiple layers, one on top of it, one on top of another. So the next type of tissue that we're discussing today is called connective tissue. And this can be grouped into different 6 major types. So there's loose connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue, adipose tissue, cartilage, bone, and actually our blood does qualify as a connective tissue, and that's because it consists of a population of cells, and they're surrounded by a non-cellular matrix called plasma, but it connects our circulatory system. So some examples of the different types of connective tissue that we have. We have loose connective tissue, so this is sort of the elastic part of our the layer that's underneath of our skin. Again, of the fibrous connective tissue forms things like our tendons and ligaments. Adipose tissue is fat tissue. Cartilage. The cartilage occurs at the end of bones, so it's this kind of softer than bone. It's also what makes up like the top of your ear and the end of your nose. There's cartilage within your rib cage, so it's a kind of a flexible, pliable tissue that connects the ends of bones and connects our rib cages together and produces the flexible parts of our exterior. Then we have bone. I think everyone knows what our bone tissue is. It makes our skeleton and our structural, the structural part of our being. And then again, blood is also part of our connective tissue. The next type of tissue is muscle tissue. We have a couple different types of muscle tissue as well. There's skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle is it's the muscle that connects it makes up our muscles, and this allows us to have voluntary movements. So our muscle causes the voluntary movements that allow us to function. Cardiac muscle is the muscle that makes up the heart. So it's the muscle that actually involuntarily functions and pumps our blood. And then there's smooth muscle, which is it lines the walls of the internal organs and the intestines. So it also functions through involuntary muscle contraction. And then finally, the final type of tissue that we'll talk about today is called nervous tissue. And this is the tissue that senses stimulus from our environment and transmits that information that it's receiving throughout the body. And it consists of these cells called neurons. And these neurons carry signals by conducting electrical impulses. So they receive an electrical impulse and transfer it to the next cell and then throughout the body. Okay, so how do these tissues work together to make our organs? So each of these tissues performs a specific function. So for example, the small intestine is lined with these columnar, see how they're kind of long and skinny like a column? They're lined by, so this is the small intestine, which is lined by columnar epithelium. It also includes connective tissue, so you see there's fat underneath there's fat underneath the skin. There's blood vessels, which consist of the connective tissue, and it has also has layers of smooth muscle. So this is the small intestine. Again, different tissues working together to make up an organ. And one really interesting field of science currently is called bioengineering. And these are scientists who are seeking ways to repair or replace damaged tissues and organs. So you all may know someone who has had an artificial knee or hip to replace a joint that's been damaged over time. We've heard about tissue transplants and things like that. So that's what we're talking about with bioengineering. And they're actually discovering new ways that organs can actually be grown on a scaffold of connective tissue from donated organs. And there are some researchers that are actually studying whether or not you can use 3D printers to create layers of cells that resemble one another. And this is actually a picture of what's called a decellularized pig heart. And this is how scientists have found that hearts and other organs from animal cadavers can be washed in a detergent which dissolves away the cells and leaves behind a scaffold of this connective tissue matrix. So we call that decellularized connective tissue. And it actually maintains the shape and the integrity of the heart. Even the small tubes and blood vessels and everything remain intact. So this scaffold, this kind of form, can then be seeded with adult stem cells, which are unspecialized cells that can transform based on the need of the situation, essentially, and become specialized. So these stem cells can become specialized cells of the heart. And this is actually a heart that's been built in a lab. So pretty fascinating. Okay, so how do these organ systems work together? So this is how we have life's functions. It's by these different systems coming together to sustain the organism as a whole. So each organ system typically consists of many different organs and has at least one function, typically has multiple functions, and it works together with other organ systems. So even though specific organ systems have specific functions, it relies on the functioning of the other systems to maintain a living organism. So an overview of the types of systems that we're talking about. So the integumentary system is like the outside of our bodies, so it's our hair, skin, and nails. Our muscular system consists, again, of that muscle tissue. Our urinary system and digestive system are two systems that work really hand in hand, which is why they're placed in this way. So the urinary system processes liquid that is taken into the body and excretes liquid waste. The digestive system processes food and excretes solid waste. We have our skeletal system, which consists of bone and cartilage tissue. It's our structure, gives us the physical. It's our physical scaffold. The circulatory and respiratory system, again, those are two systems that that rely very closely on one another. So the circulatory system is passing nutrients and gases throughout the body, and the respiratory system is taking in those gases and expressing the waste gases. We have the endocrine system, which is essentially our glandular system, the nervous system, which is our sensory, sensory processing part of our function, lymphatic and immune systems fight infections, and our reproductive system is how we reproduce. So again, just diving a little bit deeper into these partnerships between organ systems, and as I mentioned, the circulatory system and the respiratory system work hand in hand and really rely heavily on one another. So the circulatory system is delivering oxygen and nutrients throughout the body's cells, and it's also carrying the waste products like carbon dioxide and other metabolic waste, carries the carbon dioxide to the lungs so that we can exhale it, and metabolic waste are taken through the bloodstream to the kidneys so that they can be, the kidneys can process those wastes. Whereas the respiratory system is exchanging the gases with the environment. So the circulatory system is exchanging gases throughout the organism, whereas the respiratory system is exchanging gases into and out of the environment. So this is how our blood is supplied with that oxygen and how the blood is able to eventually dispose of carbon dioxide. As I mentioned, the integumentary system is one that protects against, it's our skin, hair, and nails, so this is the system that protects us against infection, excessive heat and cold. It keeps us from dehydrating and protects us because we have, as I mentioned, multiple layers of skin cells. It is our protection against physical injury as well. Skeletal system supports the body and also supports the organs. It gives us our structure, provides the framework, and has joints that allow for our muscles to move our bones. Again, the muscular system is how we have movement. It gives us our upright posture, and as muscle contractions occur, it produces body heat. Again, the urinary and digestive systems working closely together. Urinary system removing waste products from the blood, excreting it as urine. It also regulates our chemistry, our pH, and our water balance. Whereas the digestive system does a similar function, but as we're ingesting and digesting food, it helps to absorb the nutrients and eliminates undigested material. The endocrine system, as I mentioned, this is our hormonal system. It regulates body activities that help us maintain that internal state that we've talked about. I know we talked about it in Bio 101, that state of homeostasis. It helps us maintain that internal steady state that our bodies need in order to thrive. The lymphatic and immune systems are systems, again, that work together. The lymphatic system returns body fluid back to the circulatory system and is part of the immune system, which is our defense against infections and cancers and other nasty things. And then finally, our nervous system. Not finally, but our nervous system is how our body coordinates with our environment through detecting stimuli and processing the information that it's receiving from the stimulus, and then directing the response throughout the body, how it should respond to the stimulus. So, for example, if you touch a hot burner, you don't really have to think about pulling your hand away. That's your nervous system responding to the stimulus of the pain that it's causing. And then our reproductive system, we have the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. These are the parts of the organs that produce gametes and sex hormones, and also the mammary tissue that produces milk. Okay, so this is a close-up of the skin. So again, the integumentary system, the skin, hair, and nails. So this is like a general integumentary system model, just showing the different parts of of this tissue and how of this organ and how it is made up of multiple different types of tissues. So we've all, I think, heard that your skin is an organ, and yes, in fact it is. So this is the organ of your skin. As you can see, it's made up of connective tissue, the blood vessels and the fat tissue underneath the cells. It's made up of hair and hair follicles. It's got muscle tissue embedded in there. We, of course, have nerves throughout our skin cells. Glands. We have sweat glands, which is part of our endocrine system. Hair follicles, I think I've already mentioned, and you'll see that layer of simple squamous cells in there as well. So we might not all become biologists, but why we just to kind of take a little step aside and mention why sometimes it's interesting to understand these things. This is the anatomy of a pimple, and I know that's really gross, but you know, think about when you're a consumer and you're trying to understand what products to buy so that you don't have pimples. We can understand what makes a pimple, so you can decide what kinds of products to buy. So for example, this is a pimple is caused by this bacteria that enters the skin in some way. There's actually a specific bacteria that causes acne. It's called Propionibacterium acnes. And it becomes trapped in the hair follicle there, and it's recognized by the lymphatic system as being foreign, and white blood cells enter the hair follicle. So that's what causes the pus builds up, and that's what causes our pimples. So if we know that we're buying products that will reduce the likelihood of this bacteria, that's one good way to be a good consumer, through knowing how our bodies work. So acne can be pretty persistent, so there are lots of studies being done on how it can be treated. And one kind of newer technology that's being considered is the use of lasers to actually kill the bacteria and reduce acne. So this is an example of an experiment that was done on this acne treatment through laser therapy. But this is kind of an example of not such good science necessarily. So this is again, it was a study involving 19 people who had at least 5 pimples, and they had 3 laser treatments done. And what it shows is that all these participants had reduction in acne after their 3rd treatment. It might seem like this is really convincing data, but what happens is we didn't see any kind of control group. So there was no group that wasn't treated by the laser therapy for comparison. So a better study would be one like this, where we have individuals who have one side of their face that is treated through the laser therapy, and another side that is not. So that untreated side of the face can be the control group. So this is much better data that show the difference between the two groups. So between the treated side of the face and the untreated side of the face. So this shows data recorded after 4 weeks, after the 4 weeks after the 3rd treatment, and then 10 weeks after the 3rd treatment. So it shows that initially there was a reduction in acne on the treated side of the face, but over time, after 10 weeks, it's not a long-lasting response to the treatment. Okay, so moving on to how these organ systems regulate our bodies and have an internal and external exchange with our environments to help us maintain that state, that perfect state that we want to have, called homeostasis. So every organism has to exchange matter and energy with its surroundings. That's how we thrive and function. Some small animals or single-celled animals will exchange materials directly with the environment. But more complex animals have these more specialized internal structures, and allow for a more complex exchange, including exchanging materials between blood and body cells that takes place through what's called interstitial fluid. So we're going to break this question down, how the circulatory system contributes to this that process of homeostasis, so that constant steady state. Essentially, again, through exchanging, it expels when we have excess waste product in the form of CO2. It helps to exchange that out. It helps to absorb oxygen-rich gases that our bodies need. So it's constantly maintaining this steady state. So this is a model of the finely branched air tubes and blood vessels of the lungs. These are of the human lungs, and these are the areas where this gas exchange occurs. So this is the part of the respiratory system where the red deoxygenated blood is entering back into the lungs, where it is exchanged with oxygen-rich blood in the blood vessels. So again, how do animals continue to maintain homeostasis when we're constantly exposed to environments that are changing? We have to have these internal processes that allow these internal conditions to remain at the ideal levels so that we can stay alive. Excuse me. So how is this done? In this example, this is a snowy owl, and this is an animal that needs to have a pretty constant body temperature at about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And even though they live even in the winter, they're living in pretty cold conditions, that's a pretty warm temperature to have to keep. But it uses energy from its food to generate body heat, and it has this thick insulation of feathers and down that extends all the way. You can see even its feet are feathered and its beak. Those are mechanisms to help it maintain that internal environment of, again, about 40 degrees Celsius, which is about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're going to talk about how homeostasis is really dependent on this process called negative feedback. And that's not negative meaning bad, it's negative meaning switching directions. So we have these control systems that detect changes and then produce some kind of response in that change that has been detected. And these negative feedback mechanisms are extremely important to helping to keep these internal steady states that we need, and allow some small fluctuations, but to respond in a way that we can maintain homeostasis. So this is what we're talking about in negative feedback. We're going to break it down into some different levels. So yeah, this is the whole system. We might come back to this image, but I think it's easier to take a look at it step by step. So if we think about our bodies as kind of like a thermostat, so it's not just with temperature, but with water levels and nutrient levels and all of the homeostatic conditions that we need to maintain. We have this negative feedback loop, which we can relate sort of to like a thermostat. So we have the glands and the body, the systems here that regulate body temperature. So the glands that would secrete sweat if we get too hot, the glands that would cause the blood vessels to dilate if we get too cold. That brings the blood closer to the internal organs to keep our internal temperature warmer. So what happens? This is the system that we're relying on to maintain our homeostatic temperature. If we're in a situation where our temperature decreases at a certain point, what's going to happen? It's going to trigger, like if you have your thermostat in your home set to come on, if the temperature the heat to come on, if the temperature goes below 68 degrees, that's kind of this trigger right here. So we have this homeostatic optimal condition that if the body temperature decreases below that, it's going to trigger a reaction. It's going to trigger this temperature response. So and then once the temperature rises to a certain point where your thermostat might shut the heat off if it gets to be above 75, we have, again, it's that negative feedback. So that's where the negative comes from. It's actually a condition that triggers a response in the opposite direction. And it works both ways. So as the temperature falls, we have a response from our brain to have some kind of response in the body. So in this in this example, the brain is getting a sensory stimulus that the temperature has fallen below a certain point. It's going to trigger the blood vessels below the skin to constrict, again, to keep the internal organs warmed and minimize loss of heat. It also will cause some muscle contraction like shivering that helps to generate heat, and that will help to increase body temperature. So again, this temperature below a certain point is what triggers this negative feedback response. So it causes something to happen in the opposite direction to cause the opposite condition. So temperature falling causes reactions that will trigger the body to react in a way that increases temperature. So that's what we mean by negative feedback. And we have some illustrations of this, and then I think that's it for the chapter. Let me see if I can make these work. Ooh.
This simple animation illustrates the principle of negative feedback, or feedback inhibition, in the regulation of a chemical reaction sequence in a cell. The sequence involves 4 molecules, A, B, C, and D. 3 different enzymes catalyze the conversion of one molecule to the next. The final product, D, inhibits the first enzyme in the sequence. When the concentration of D rises to a certain point, the reaction shuts itself down. In positive feedback, a product of the reaction sequence enhances the action of one of the enzymes, increasing the rate of production of the product. Positive feedback is less common than negative feedback in living systems.
Just to mention, and again, as she mentioned, positive feedback is less common. That would be things like the response to make things continue further. So 2 examples would be through childbirth. So as the body goes into labor, that's not a condition that the body wants to stay in forever. That's not a homeostatic ideal situation. But instead of turning it off in the opposite direction, a positive feedback would be for the body to continue to proliferate the contractions until childbirth happens, and then that feedback loop would shut down. Similarly, the production of milk, once a child is born, the mother would start to produce milk. That's not a permanent situation, but it is the positive feedback would be the continued production of the milk enzyme. So that's what we're talking about with positive feedback. Typically, our responses are working in that our homeostatic regulation is maintained through negative feedbacks. So again, as always, folks, please email me, send me any questions that you might have. I hope everything is going well, and I hope you're all staying safe and doing well.